Blood once bubbled up from America's soil. Children once choked to death in their mother's arms. Entire families convinced they had been drained by vampires. Fields turned barren, and people whispered, "The devil walked there at night." Welcome, wanderer. You have stepped into a hall of echoes, a library built not of stone, but of silence and fear. This is more than a story. It is a dissection table where folklore is laid bare and superstition is weighed against the scalpel of science. Here, myths are not retold. They are opened, examined, and unmasked. America is young, yet its ghosts are ancient. They linger in orphanages that never burned, in houses where the sick coughed themselves into early graves, in crossroads where blood once soaked into the dust. These phantoms are not strangers from another realm. They are the reflections of epidemics, of grief, of wounds carved so deep into memory that only myth could explain them. Science has since named their killers: diphtheria, the strangling angel of children; tuberculosis, once mistaken for vampirism; poisoned soil, where salt or fungi killed roots and birthed legends of the devil's circle; vaccines, antibiotics, chemistry, all tore the mask away. Yet still the myths endure. Because truth may heal the body, but legend comforts the wound in the soul. And so, the haunted map of America is drawn, not by demons, but by sorrow. Each cursed place is a monument to something real: death, despair, and silence too heavy to bear. Step closer. The curtain rises. Our exploration begins. In northern Ohio, near the quiet town of Vermilion, there lies a road whose name alone can chill the blood: Gore Orphanage Road. It cuts through forest and farmland, winding past the Black River, its surface cracked by years of neglect. By day, it seems ordinary, the kind of rural track where children ride bicycles and farmers haul grain. But when night falls, the trees lean close, their branches tangled like the ribs of some forgotten beast, and the air grows unnervingly still. Travelers say their headlights dim without reason. Engines falter. And somewhere along that shadowed stretch, whispers insist, once stood a house where children died in fire. The locals still tell it the same way. Stop your car at the bend where the Swift mansion once stood, kill the engine, and listen. At first there is only silence, heavy and expectant. Then, faint as smoke, the sob of a child. A pounding follows, small fists hammering against locked doors. And then comes the scream, the kind that ends too suddenly, cut off as though swallowed by flame. The ruins have been gone for decades, yet people swear the air still carries the bitter tang of smoke. Some hikers claim to have seen faces pressed against phantom windows, pale eyes staring from the darkness. Lovers who once parked along the roadside told of shadows circling their cars and of voices whispering just outside the glass. For more than a century, the story has endured. Farmers in the early 20th century warned strangers never to linger near the place. Teenagers of the 1960s drove out in battered Chevrolets, daring each other to sit in silence until they heard the cries. Even now, paranormal investigators haul cameras and recorders into the night, returning with hours of static and, sometimes, noises too human to dismiss. Gore Orphanage is not simply a ruin in memory. It is a ritual of fear, repeated by each generation. And yet, beneath the legend lies a truth that is no less haunting. There was no orphanage here that burned with children inside. The building at the heart of the tale was the Swift Mansion, built in 1840 by a wealthy family, later abandoned, and eventually consumed by fire. No records mention orphans trapped in its walls. The cries people claimed to hear did not come from flame, but from something more insidious, something real. In the 19th century, this part of Ohio was ravaged by disease. Diphtheria, known then as the strangling angel of children, swept through towns like Vermilion and nearby Oberlin. Caused by a bacterium, it coated children's throats with a gray membrane, suffocating them while their parents looked on helplessly. Entire families buried multiple children in a single season. Imagine the sound of those last choking cries. Imagine the silence afterward, so unbearable that any echo, the moan of wind through broken beams, the cry of a fox in the woods, could be mistaken for a child's ghost. This is how grief shapes landscape. The abandoned Swift mansion became a vessel for sorrow. The epidemics of diphtheria and scarlet fever gave the cries their voices. Memory stitched tragedy into place until a fire that never happened was remembered more vividly than the ones that did. Even today, though medicine has nearly eradicated diphtheria with vaccines, the myth persists because truth can heal the body, but legend comforts the wound in the soul. So when you drive Gore Orphanage Road at night and the trees crowd out the stars and the silence deepens until you hear more than silence, ask yourself, are those the voices of the dead? Or are they the echoes of grief so heavy, so unbearable, that a community had no choice but to give it the shape of fire and the sound of children screaming? Legends rarely need evidence. They grow in whispers, carried by fear, and repeated until repetition itself makes them true. The story of the burned children at Gore Orphanage is no exception. For more than a century, the tale has been told in kitchens and classrooms, across campfires and barroom counters, until it became less a rumor and more a ritual. Children in Vermilion once dared each other to walk the road alone at night. They would march bravely past the tree line, each footstep heavier than the last, until the silence pressed in so tightly they broke and ran. When they returned, gasping, they swore they had heard something, the faint cry of a child or the smell of charred wood. Farmers told them, "Of course you heard it, those are the orphans." And so the story took root in the young, who would one day pass it to their own children. By the early 20th century, the tale had spread far beyond northern Ohio. Newspapers in Cleveland occasionally referenced the haunted orphanage, and travelers wrote about it in letters. Soldiers during World War II, returning home to the Midwest, repeated the story to bunkmates who had never set foot in Ohio. The name itself, Gore Orphanage, was too powerful to forget. It sounded like a headline, a sermon, and a curse all at once. The details, of course, shifted with each telling. Some said the fire broke out late at night when the children were locked in their dormitories. Others insisted it was punishment, that cruel caretakers chained the doors and left the young to burn. A few whispered darker theories still, imagining that the flames were no accident but the work of a devil cult hidden in the woods. In each version, the outcome was the same. Dozens of children died, their spirits bound forever to the ruins. Teenagers who drove out to the site in the 1950s and 60s swore they saw spectral faces flickering in the dark. A group of high schoolers claimed that when they parked at the bend in the road, the car filled with smoke though no fire burned. Another night, a boy staggered home pale and trembling, insisting that a child's hand had brushed against his arm though no one was there. Whether lies, dares, or genuine terror, each story added a stone to the growing monument of fear. But legends do not survive on fear alone. They endure because they serve a purpose. For some, Gore Orphanage was a parable, a warning to children not to wander too far. For others, it was proof of the supernatural, a way to argue that death was not the end but merely a passage into shadow. And for the grieving families of northern Ohio, whose own children had died not in fire but in epidemics, the legend offered a strange comfort. If voices still cried out on the road, then perhaps the dead were not truly gone. Scholars who studied the folklore noticed something peculiar. The farther the tale spread from Vermilion, the more vivid and cruel the details became. In small towns, people whispered simply of children who died in the fire. In cities, however, the story twisted into grotesque horror. Children nailed into their rooms, flames licking at their fingers, caretakers fleeing into the woods while the young burned alive. The legend evolved the way nightmares do, feeding on imagination, reshaping itself into whatever form most unsettled the listener. Yet at its core, the story never changed. Gore Orphanage was a place of children's screams, and the land still carried their echoes. Whether or not it had happened did not matter. What mattered was that people believed it, and, in believing, they made it real. By the 1970s, the legend had become a cultural touchstone. College students drove out to prove themselves fearless. Journalists wrote skeptical articles, and paranormal groups arrived with cameras. Each time, new stories bloomed. A recorder captured faint knocks in the silence. A photograph revealed a blur that looked like a child's face. Rational explanations, wind, light, tricks of the ear, were offered, but the legend did not weaken. It strengthened, because disbelief itself is part of the ritual. To deny the legend is to repeat it, and repeating it keeps it alive. The burned children of Gore Orphanage never existed, but in the minds of those who hear the story, they have lived and died 1,000 times, their screams as vivid now as they were a century ago. That is the strange power of folklore. It creates its own truth, one fire at a time. Legends are easy to dismiss when they are distant, when they belong to someone else's town, someone else's memory. But Gore Orphanage refuses to remain a story of the past. It intrudes into the present, into the ears of those who dare the road at night. And it intrudes most powerfully in the form of sound, raw, unexplainable, and unforgettable. One autumn evening in 1957, two brothers from Vermilion drove out along Gore Orphanage Road after hearing classmates dare them to test their courage. The car was an old Ford, its headlights cutting weak tunnels through the forest. They parked near the ruins of the Swift mansion, killed the engine, and waited. At first there was only silence, so heavy it made them laugh nervously. Then came a sound like knuckles rapping faintly on wood. The younger brother swore it came from behind the car. The older insisted it came from the trees. Both froze as the tapping grew louder, sharper, until it became pounding. Then, a cry, a child's voice, shrill, rising to a scream that ended too suddenly, as if the air itself had been severed. Terrified, they fled. For years afterward, neither would walk that road alone. Stories like theirs multiply with each generation. In the 1970s, a group of college students brought tape recorders, hoping to catch evidence of the supernatural. The machines captured only static for hours until one moment when a faint sound broke through. A sob, high-pitched and short-lived, like a child gasping for air. Skeptics pointed to the cries of foxes or owls, animals known to mimic human tones, but those who heard the tape swore it was something else. One listener, a father who had lost a daughter to illness, broke down in tears. That, he said, is the sound of a child choking. More chilling still are the encounters that involve no machines, no cars, no witnesses, but the human ear. A hiker in the early 1990s, walking the trail near the river, reported hearing laughter echoing in the trees. It was playful at first, the kind of giggle one expects from children chasing each other in a schoolyard. But it did not fade. It grew louder, circling him until the laughter turned to wails. He ran until his lungs gave out, convinced the voices were at his heels. When he told his story later, his face was pale and his hands shook. It was not the forest, he said. It was children. I know what children sound like. And then there are the accounts of smell, for sound is rarely alone. Several witnesses have described the acrid stench of smoke filling the air at the same moment the cries begin. One woman in 2003 claimed she woke from a faint doze in her parked car to find the interior thick with the smell of burning wood. No fire was visible. Her clothes carried the scent for days, she swore, though her family dismissed it as imagination. Science has its answers, of course. The human brain is wired to find patterns in randomness, to mistake wind for whispers and animal cries for human voices. When placed in silence, our ears manufacture sound, amplifying the faintest noise into something recognizable. Psychologists call it pareidolia of the senses, the tendency to shape chaos into meaning. But those who have stood on Gore Orphanage Road at night argue that no trick of the brain could explain the terror that rooted them in place, nor the certainty that what they heard was not wind, not foxes, but children. The screams endure because they are more than noise. They are a ritual. Teenagers go to prove their bravery. Adults return to relive their youth. Investigators arrive to test their equipment, and each finds what they expect, or fear, to find. The legend supplies the context, and the human mind supplies the rest. Yet, in the silence of that Ohio road, where the forest crowds out the stars and the night presses down like a weight, even the most hardened skeptic admits it is difficult not to hear something. And so the cries of Gore Orphanage live on. Not in archives, not in official records, but in the trembling voices of those who swore they heard the pounding of fists, the sudden cut of a scream, the echo of children long gone. Whether ghost or grief, illusion or memory, the night has its own testimony, and it is louder than any denial. Every legend demands a reason. Ghosts rarely linger without cause, and the whispers of Gore Orphanage soon grew into something darker than grief. The belief that the children were not merely victims, but agents of vengeance, spirits bound to punish those who dared disturb their place of death. The idea of a curse appeared early in local folklore. Farmers claimed their crops withered if they tilled too close to the ruins of the Swift mansion. Wagons broke down on the road for no clear reason, and livestock refused to graze near the tree line. A man in 1912 reported that his horses balked and reared each time they passed the bend, eyes rolling white, froth dripping from their mouths. They smell the fire, he explained, though no smoke had risen from that ground in decades. For neighbors, it was proof enough that the land itself was marked. By the 1930s, children dared each other not only to walk the road at night, but to shout insults into the darkness. Those who returned told stories of punishment, shoes lost in the mud, sudden fevers, nightmares that lasted for weeks. Parents, half believing, warned their children that mocking the orphans invited the curse to follow them home. Soon, the legend was no longer just about voices. It was about consequence. To hear the cries was one thing, to disrespect them was to risk retribution. The curse deepened in later decades. Teenagers who vandalized the site, spray painting the crumbling stone or carrying away fragments as trophies, told of accidents that followed. One boy broke his leg in a car crash the same week he pocketed a brick. Another swore that the night after he scrawled his name on the walls, he woke to the sound of knocking on his bedroom window, though he lived miles away. Rational minds pointed to coincidence, but in Vermilion the stories wove into one another, forming a tapestry of fear. Even modern paranormal investigators, armed with cameras and EMF meters, speak cautiously about the site. Some claim that batteries drain inexplicably, that equipment malfunctions in ways unseen elsewhere. A few whisper that the land itself rejects intrusion, that the so-called curse of the orphans is not a metaphor but a pattern. Misfortune follows those who trespass too boldly. From a psychological perspective, the belief in curses is both ancient and stubborn. Humans are wired to search for cause and effect, to assign meaning to accidents. A car crash, an illness, a nightmare. If these follow a night at Gore Orphanage, the mind forges a connection. Folklorists call it ostension, when life imitates legend. People shape their experiences to fit the story, and the story in turn grows stronger. But to the believers, this is no trick of the mind. It is proof that the orphans guard their ashes. The fire that supposedly birthed the legend may never have happened, but the idea of a curse transformed Gore Orphanage from a haunted ruin into a place of power, not just a site where voices might be heard, but a boundary one crossed at one's own peril. The road became more than geography. It became a threshold. And so, when the wind rattles the trees along Gore Orphanage Road and the night presses in with the scent of smoke, people do not simply hear cries. They wonder if those cries are warnings or invitations, if the pounding fists and sudden screams are echoes of children begging for help, or something far older and sharper, spirits that will not forgive, that demand recognition, that curse those who refuse to remember. The question remains, is it the memory of fire that haunts the road, or the vengeance of the forgotten? Either answer chills the blood, for both suggest the same truth, that some wounds, whether born of tragedy or of belief, never heal. Fear, once shared often enough, begins to change shape. It ceases to be a private terror and becomes something communal, a story people seek out rather than flee. Gore Orphanage, once whispered as a curse along a lonely Ohio road, followed this path. Over the decades, it transformed from tragedy into entertainment, from whispered warning into advertised attraction. By the 1960s, the legend had already settled deep into the imagination of Vermillion's youth. Teenagers drove out in rusted Chevrolets, headlights off, laughing too loudly to cover the tremor in their voices. They dared each other to wait in silence until the cries began. For some, the road was simply a test of bravery. For others, it was a rite of passage. The name itself, so blunt, so soaked in dread, was irresistible. To claim you had driven Gore Orphanage Road at midnight was to wear a badge of courage. Soon outsiders arrived, drawn by curiosity. Articles in local papers, half skeptical and half gleeful, described the hauntings. Paranormal magazines published breathless accounts of Ohio's most haunted road. With each retelling, the story grew sharper, more theatrical. The burned children were no longer anonymous. They had names, invented or misremembered, but repeated until they sounded real. Their screams were not whispers on the wind, but shrieks echoing in stereo across the forest. The legend, like a performance, adjusted itself to meet the appetite of its audience. By the 1980s and 1990s, ghost hunters armed with cameras, tape recorders, and dowsing rods were arriving in groups. They reported drained batteries, eerie static, and the occasional unexplained noise, a knock, a sob, a sudden scream. These findings, circulated on VHS tapes, passed between enthusiasts, turning Gore Orphanage into a pilgrimage site for the growing subculture of paranormal investigation. Every visitor left with a story, and every story added another layer of belief. Local businesses noticed. Diners and motels began referencing the haunted road in brochures. Halloween tours sprouted up, guiding tourists to the site where they could stand in the dark and listen for the cries. Souvenir shops sold postcards, T-shirts, even bricks claimed to be from the ruins of the Swift Mansion. The legend that once thrived on grief now thrived on commerce. For folklorists, Gore Orphanage became a textbook example of how legends evolve. A story born from misunderstanding and sorrow had become a cultural commodity, sustaining itself not through fear alone, but through ritualized retelling. The scholar Linda Daig once wrote that legends survive because they balance belief and disbelief. They are not proven, but not disproven either. Gore Orphanage exemplifies this balance. Skeptics scoff, believers swear by their experiences, and both keep the story alive simply by repeating it. The irony is sharp. A tale that began as whispered testimony of voices in the night now appears on glossy travel websites. Tour buses rattle down the road in October, headlights sweeping the trees, passengers giggling nervously as guides recount the fire that never was. The screams, if they come, are drowned out by laughter and the snap of smartphone cameras. What once was grief has become spectacle, and yet the legend loses none of its power. The commercialization of Gore Orphanage has not erased its menace. If anything, it has deepened it. For even as tourists laugh, even as skeptics dismiss, the road remains dark, the trees remain close, and silence still has a way of pressing into the lungs until one swears they hear more than wind. Those who arrive seeking amusement sometimes leave unsettled, carrying home the faint memory of a sob in the distance. Thus Gore Orphanage endures, not only as a story of loss, but as an industry of fear. It reminds us that humans do not simply tell legends, they sell them, consume them, and feed them back into culture. A road in northern Ohio has become a stage where tragedy, belief, and profit converge. And somewhere in that uneasy mixture, the cries of the children, real or imagined, continue to echo. For more than a century, the story of Gore Orphanage has been repeated with the weight of scripture. Children trapped in a burning building, their screams echoing through the trees. A curse laid upon the land, a road forever haunted. But when the layers of myth are peeled back, what remains is not a massacre. It is something both more ordinary and more tragic. There was never an orphanage that burned with children inside. The building at the heart of the legend was the Swift Mansion, erected in 1840 by a wealthy family and abandoned decades later. In the early 1900s, the property was briefly used as a home for children, but no fire consumed it while they lived there. The mansion did eventually burn, but years after it had already been deserted. No lives were lost in its flames. The orphanage fire was a story born not of event, but of imagination. What then of the screams? Why do so many swear they heard them? The answer lies in the silent catastrophes of the 19th century. Northern Ohio, like much of America, was scourged by epidemics. Diphtheria, the strangling angel, spread through towns like Vermilion, coating children's throats with a gray membrane until they suffocated. Scarlet fever, too, carried off the young in waves. Entire families buried row upon row of children, often in small rural cemeteries not far from Gore Orphanage Road. In a world before antibiotics or vaccines, death was common, and grief demanded explanation. When the human mind cannot bear silence, it fills it with echoes. The cries people reported on that lonely road may well have been the calls of foxes or owls whose voices uncannily resemble human wails. But for parents who had once heard their children gasp for breath, those sounds fused with memory until they were indistinguishable from the real thing. The haunted road was not haunted by fire. It was haunted by grief. Historians point out another detail. The word Gore in Gore Orphanage is not a reference to blood but to a local family name. Yet the coincidence proved irresistible. The mansion's ruins stood abandoned, the children's home was associated with sorrow, and the name itself conjured violence. Over time, tragedy, language, and imagination braided into a single narrative. The fire that never happened became more vivid than the ones that did. Even modern science cannot erase this. Psychologists describe the phenomenon as ostension, when legend shapes experience. People expect to hear cries, so their minds amplify the wind, the rustling of trees, the calls of animals until they become screams. Once recorded, shared, and retold, these experiences harden into proof. Skeptics dismiss them, but the very act of arguing keeps the story alive. And so, the truth of Gore Orphanage is not a tale of supernatural fire. It is a mirror reflecting the pain of a community. The Swift mansion burned empty, but the children of Vermilion did die. In beds, in homes, in waves of disease that swept the land. Their parents, unable to accept silence, gave their grief a voice. Over decades, folklore transfigured it into something larger, something that strangers could share and fear together. This is the paradox of haunted places. They are rarely haunted by the dead. They are haunted by memory, by sorrow too deep to fade. The screams on Gore Orphanage Road are not warnings from beyond the grave. They are the echoes of diphtheria and scarlet fever, of nights spent listening helplessly to a child's final gasp. The truth strips away the fear and the curse, but it leaves behind something more unsettling. Proof that human suffering is enough to haunt a landscape for generations. What is more terrifying? That spirits linger in the woods, or that grief alone can create ghosts. In Atchison, Kansas, a quiet town perched on the bluffs of the Missouri River, stands a modest two-story house with white siding and a small front porch. From the street, it appears ordinary, the kind of Midwestern home where children ride bicycles across cracked sidewalks and neighbors wave politely from trimmed lawns. Yet within its walls, countless visitors have claimed to encounter something extraordinary, something so persistent that the house has been named one of the most haunted in America. This is the Sallie House. The story begins, as so many do, with a whisper of tragedy. According to local lore, a young girl named Sallie was brought to the home in the early 20th century, suffering from acute abdominal pain. The house at that time belonged to a physician. In one version, Sallie was diagnosed with appendicitis. In another, she was thought to have some mysterious internal blockage. Whatever the case, the doctor began surgery on the kitchen table, but without anesthesia. The child, so the tale claims, screamed until her voice broke, and then she died. In fury or in despair, her spirit clung to the house, waiting for anyone who dared to live there afterward. For decades, the story was little more than a local curiosity, shared among neighbors and passed down to children as a cautionary tale. But everything changed in the 1990s, when a young couple, Tony and Deborah Pickman, moved into the house. At first, they noticed small disturbances, objects misplaced, lights flickering, their dog growling at unseen corners. Then the activity escalated. Tony reported scratches appearing on his arms and chest, sometimes in the shape of tiny hands. Toys arranged themselves in patterns. Photographs captured strange anomalies, dark figures, or streaks of light where none should have been. Word spread quickly. Paranormal investigators descended on Atchison, armed with cameras, recorders, and electromagnetic meters. The Sallie House became a laboratory for ghost hunters, a stage where the legend was not just told, but tested. To many, the scratches on Tony's body were undeniable evidence of a malicious presence. To others, the story of Sallie's failed surgery gave the house its chilling personality, not merely a haunted home, but a place where innocence had turned to rage. Yet beneath the whispers lies a puzzle. No death certificate for a Sallie has ever been found. No medical records confirm that a child was operated on in that house. Local historians scoured archives and came up empty. Still, the lack of evidence did not kill the legend. It only made it more alluring. The mystery itself became fuel. If Sallie had never lived, then what exactly haunted the house? And if she had, why was her memory absent from official history? Folklorists note how such stories thrive in communities like Atchison, a small town proud of its heritage, yet hungry for identity, finds in a haunted house both a warning and a lure. Residents can whisper of tragedy while inviting outsiders to witness it. The legend becomes both shield and beacon, proof that their town harbors secrets and an opportunity to profit from curiosity. Today, the Sallie House is a tourist attraction. Visitors pay to spend the night, to wander the narrow halls with cameras in hand, to sit in the nursery and wait for a child's giggle or a sudden scratch. For some, it is theater. For others, it is revelation. Either way, the story endures, retold with every recording of static, every photograph of a blur, every gasp in the dark. And so the little white house on North 2nd Street stands unchanged, its windows blank and its paint peeling, while the legend inside grows ever darker. Whether or not Sallie ever existed matters less than the fact that people believe she did. For in belief, she continues to breathe, to scratch, to remind visitors that innocence, when betrayed, can become something monstrous. Legends thrive on detail. The more vivid the image, the deeper it lodges in the imagination. For the Sallie House, the legend crystallized around a single scene: a frightened child on a table, the smell of antiseptic and sweat in the air, the desperate hands of a doctor cutting into her without the mercy of anesthesia. According to the most common version, Sallie was 6 years old when she was brought to the house on North 2nd Street in Atchison. She clutched her stomach, writhing with pain. Her mother, frantic and poor, begged the physician who lived there to help. The doctor, convinced her appendix was on the verge of bursting, rushed to operate. Time, he believed, was the enemy. Yet in his haste, he made a fateful choice. He cut before administering ether. The little girl screamed, thrashed, begged for mercy. Neighbors claimed her cries rang down the block. And then, as the story goes, she died on the table, her last breath seared with terror. The image is powerful, too powerful. A child betrayed not only by her body, but by the very hands meant to save her. From that moment, the legend says, the house was marked. Sallie's ghost did not appear as a gentle spirit but as a force of anger. She tugged at clothing, threw objects, scratched Tony Pickman's arms until blood welled. Her small hands became instruments of vengeance, replaying in eternity the violation of that final hour. Of course, historians find problems immediately. No medical records name a Sallie. No newspaper reports describe a botched surgery in Atchison during that era. Some versions place the event in the 1920s, others in the 1930s, still others decades earlier. In folklore, inconsistency is not a weakness, it is a survival tactic. The details shift so the story can adapt, remaining believable no matter how times change. Psychologists suggest another reason the surgery tale resonates. Few fears cut deeper than the betrayal of trust, especially in the realm of medicine. The image of a doctor harming a child on the very table meant to heal her mirrors real anxieties of the early 20th century. In that era, medicine was advancing but still unreliable. Anesthesia was imperfect. Infection was common. Countless families carried stories of loved ones lost not to illness but to treatment. The Sallie House legend distilled all those anxieties into a single unforgettable scene. Paranormal investigators in the 1990s found the surgery motif irresistible. When the Pickmans reported Tony's scratches, believers pointed to Sallie's supposed suffering on the table. The parallel was too neat. A child cut open in life, cutting others in death. Television specials dramatized the moment, showing actresses portraying Sallie shrieking under the knife, her spirit rising to curse the house. The image, repeated across screens and magazines, solidified into fact for many viewers. And yet, the absence of evidence is striking. No one has uncovered a death certificate. The Atchison Globe, The town's newspaper of record contains no obituary for a Sallie matching the story. Local archives list physicians living on North 2nd Street, but none mention a botched appendectomy. The silence of the record speaks as loudly as any ghost. Still, legends are not bound by archives. They thrive in what cannot be disproven. Ask 10 locals and you may hear 10 variations. That Sallie died on the table, that she died hours later of infection, that she never died at all but lingered in fevered agony. Each telling carries the same undercurrent, that the house is stained by blood unjustly spilled. In this way, the bloody surgery became the heart of the Sallie House myth. It explains the scratches, the anger, the restless energy reported by visitors. It gives the ghost not just a name, but a motive. And though historians remind us there was no Sallie, no verifiable surgery, the story remains too compelling to die. For in that image of the child betrayed, the community found a ghost worthy of fear, pity, and endless retelling. Every haunted house has its stage, and in the Sallie House, the staircase plays that role. Narrow and steep, with a single banister worn smooth by decades of hands, it connects the first floor to the upstairs nursery. Visitors describe an uncanny heaviness that clings to the steps, as though the air itself thickens there. Many who cross it report the same sensation, that someone unseen is standing just above, waiting. The Pickman family was the first to speak of the shadow. Deborah, alone one afternoon, carried laundry toward the stairs when she froze. At the top landing, framed by dim light from the nursery, stood the silhouette of a small figure. It did not move, did not breathe, but watched her in utter stillness. Then, as she blinked, it vanished. She fled the house trembling, convinced she had seen Sallie herself. Tony Pickman's encounters were more violent. He described climbing the staircase one evening when a sudden pressure struck his chest, forcing him backward. As he steadied himself, scratches appeared across his abdomen, red and stinging, as though invisible nails had raked him. Later, he reported hearing footsteps on the stairs at night, soft, rapid, like a child hurrying in the dark. He would rise to find the staircase empty, the air sharp with a coldness that lingered long after. Other witnesses echo the same details. Paranormal investigators carrying cameras up the stairs complained of batteries dying instantly. Photographs captured streaks of light darting near the banister. Some swore they saw a small hand clutching the railing before slipping away. One visitor described hearing laughter at the top step, followed by a sudden shove that nearly sent him tumbling. He left the house that night and never returned. Skeptics, of course, offer explanations. The staircase is narrow and poorly lit. Shadows distort easily. Drafts flow from the attic, creating cold pockets. The power of suggestion, the knowledge that others have seen Sallie on the stairs, primes visitors to expect her. Yet even psychologists who study hauntings admit the reports are remarkably consistent. Independent groups, arriving years apart, describe the same phenomenon. A child-sized presence, fleeting but forceful. The symbolism of the staircase deepens the legend. Stairs are thresholds, liminal spaces between one level and another, between safety and danger. Folklorists note that ghosts often appear on staircases in literature and legend because they embody transition, the place where the living cross into shadow. For the Sallie House, the staircase is not just architecture, it is the stage where grief and imagination collide. Some investigators connect the haunting directly to the surgery legend. If Sallie's final moments were filled with fear, perhaps her spirit lingers in the house, moving restlessly between rooms, searching for escape. The scratches on Tony's body, the pushes and cold spots, are interpreted as the rage of a child betrayed. The shadow on the staircase is her warning that the upstairs nursery is hers and trespassers enter at their own risk. But perhaps the most chilling detail is how the shadow seems to know its audience. Believers leave convinced they have seen a ghost. Skeptics leave shaken by experiences they cannot explain. One visitor, a police officer known for his pragmatism, admitted quietly afterward, "I don't believe in ghosts, but I swear to you, something was standing on that staircase." The shadow endures because it offers no certainty. It does not leave fingerprints or records. It leaves impressions, memories, the uneasy feeling that one has brushed against the edge of something unknowable. And for those who walk the stairs of the Sallie House, that uncertainty is worse than proof, for proof can be explained. But the shadow? It simply waits, watching, just beyond the reach of reason. In haunted houses, mirrors are never innocent. They reflect more than faces. They return the weight of memory, bending truth into illusion. In the Sallie House, it is the mirrors that unsettle visitors most deeply. Not the footsteps on the stairs or the scratching on skin, but the fleeting impression that, for a heartbeat, the glass holds someone who should not be there. Accounts repeat the same image: eyes, small, unblinking, set just below the height of an adult's gaze. Visitors sitting in the upstairs nursery claim they have glanced toward the antique dresser mirror and seen, beside their own reflection, a child staring back. Sometimes the face vanishes before they can cry out. Sometimes it lingers, pale and patient, until they turn away in terror. Deborah Pickman once described looking into the bathroom mirror late at night. Her own reflection was there, but over her shoulder, just for an instant, was the face of a little girl, her mouth open as if mid-scream. She dropped the glass she held, shattering it across the sink, and refused to enter that bathroom again without lights blazing. Paranormal investigators have captured photographs of mirrors in the house where faint outlines seem to appear, smudges shaped like small hands, streaks of light forming eyes. Skeptics dismiss them as pareidolia, the mind's tendency to see faces in random patterns. But believers argue the consistency is too striking. Independent groups, separated by years, record the same descriptions: the eyes of a child staring back where no child stands. The psychology of mirrors deepens the mystery. Researchers know that in low light, the human brain is prone to distort reflections. Staring into a mirror in darkness can trigger the Troxler effect, in which features fade and morph until the face appears monstrous or strange. Add suggestion, the knowledge that a ghost child may linger in the glass, and the brain delivers exactly what is expected. The legend becomes self-fulfilling, burned into the retina by fear itself, and yet even science cannot erase the emotional punch of the experience. Visitors do not describe vague impressions, they describe detail. A curl of hair, the outline of a dress, eyes that shimmer with tears. One investigator, a seasoned skeptic, confessed afterward, "I know the psychology, I know the tricks, but when those eyes met mine, it didn't feel like a trick. It felt like someone begging me to see them." Mirrors hold special weight in folklore. Across cultures, they are considered portals, fragile boundaries between worlds. Breaking one is bad luck because it fractures the self. Covering mirrors after a death is a ritual meant to prevent spirits from getting trapped. In the Sallie House, the mirror becomes more than a reflective surface. It is the threshold where Sallie herself waits, half seen, half believed. The twist of the legend lies here. What if Sallie is not in the walls or the stairs at all? What if she survives only in the minds of those who believe, projected onto the glass by grief and fear? The child in the mirror may not be a ghost, but a collective hallucination, a pattern stitched by dozens of witnesses who expected to see her. In this view, Sallie is not a spirit but an idea, yet no less real, for ideas can haunt as deeply as flesh. Whether ghost or illusion, The mirror eyes have become one of the Sallie House's defining horrors. Tourists sit in front of the nursery dresser, cameras poised, waiting for the flicker of movement in the corner of the glass. Some laugh when nothing appears. Others swear they leave with photographs that chill them for years. The mirror, like the staircase, has become ritual. To face it is to confront the possibility that belief itself can summon what does not exist. And so the legend of Sallie grows, each reflection doubling her presence. A house once ordinary now harbors a girl who may never have lived, whose gaze follows visitors through silvered glass. The eyes in the mirror are not proof of ghosts. They are proof of how powerfully the human mind and the human need for story can make ghosts real. Legends once spread slowly, carried by rumor, repeated around campfires, retold by neighbors across fences. But in the late 20th century, Sallie no longer belonged only to Atchison. Her story slipped onto television screens, crept into message boards, and eventually flooded YouTube videos and paranormal podcasts. In the span of a decade, Sallie transformed from a local whisper to an international ghost star. The turning point came in the 1990s with the Pickman haunting. Television networks, hungry for supernatural programming, descended on the small house in Kansas. Shows like Sightings dramatized the family's experiences, toys rearranging themselves, photographs of shadowy figures, scratches carved into Tony Pickman's shin as cameras rolled. Millions of viewers watched, and for many, Sallie became the face of American haunting. Unlike distant castles in Europe or fog-wrapped English moors, this ghost lived in an ordinary Midwestern house, the kind viewers could imagine on their own street. When the internet arrived, Sallie's legend exploded. Early paranormal forums in the 2000s swarmed with posts about the house. Users shared grainy photos of glowing orbs, shaky videos of footsteps on the stairs, and frantic testimonies of overnight stays. The story became fluid, rewritten by each storyteller. Some describe Sallie as a mischievous child spirit seeking a playmate. Others painted her as demonic, disguising herself in the form of innocence. Each version added fuel to the myth, and in the chaotic ecosystem of online rumor, Sallie thrived. YouTube gave her a new stage. Channels devoted to ghost hunting posted hours of footage from inside the house, investigators whispering questions into the dark, sudden gasps at faint knocks or electronic spikes. Comments filled with viewers insisting they saw a face in the shadows or heard a giggle in the static. TikTok later distilled the legend into short bursts: a doll rocking on its own, a mirror catching what looked like a child's reflection, a tourist screaming as the lights flickered. For a generation raised online, Sallie was no longer folklore. She was content. The town of Atchison embraced the transformation. The Sallie House became a centerpiece of its haunted tours, drawing visitors from across the country. Each October, crowds lined up to walk its halls, phones ready, chasing the possibility of catching Sallie on video. Tourism dollars flowed, and with them came an incentive to keep the legend alive. Hotels advertised haunted weekend packages, restaurants themed menus with ghostly names, and the house itself charged for overnight investigations. Fear had become a product, and Sallie was its brand. Scholars of folklore note how perfectly Sallie's legend fit the internet age. She is simple enough to summarize in a headline: "Child ghost scratches visitors in Kansas home," but ambiguous enough to invite endless speculation. Unlike a closed story with a beginning and end, Sallie's narrative is open, porous, ready for new layers. Every photo, every video, every scream posted online becomes another brick in her legend. And yet, with fame comes distortion. Some online retellings insist Sallie was not a child at all but a demon. Others place her death in the 1800s, long before the house was even built. Still others conflate her with unrelated hauntings, dragging her image across states and continents. What began as a local tale of a girl's tragic surgery became a global myth, reshaped by clicks and views. The irony is sharp. There is no historical record of Sallie, no certificate, no obituary. Yet on the internet, she is more alive than ever, scratching strangers on camera, whispering in audio files, staring from mirrors in TikTok clips replayed millions of times. She may never have existed, but online she cannot die. In this way, Sallie House is no longer just a haunted site. It is a cultural phenomenon, proof that in the digital age, belief spreads faster than fact. And somewhere inside that modest white house in Atchison, amid the peeling paint and narrow staircase, visitors still sit in the nursery, mirrors and cameras ready, waiting for Sallie to appear, because the internet told them she would. The Sallie House survives on whispers, but whispers are not records. For decades, historians and skeptics alike have searched the archives of Atchison, combing through death certificates, census lists, property records, and medical logs. They found physicians, yes, men who practiced in the house on North 2nd Street. They found families who rented its rooms, neighbors who lived alongside it. But they did not find Sallie. Not a death notice, not a medical report, not even the faintest scrap of official evidence that a girl by that name ever died in that home. This absence is not a small oversight. In the early 20th century, even poor families in Atchison left a paper trail when a child died. An obituary in the Atchison Globe, a burial record in Mount Vernon Cemetery, a parish note in local church registers. For Sallie, there is nothing. The trail vanishes into rumor. What then explains the legend? Folklorists point to the anxieties of medicine in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Appendectomies were new, anesthesia was imperfect, and surgical deaths were common. Families often blamed doctors, accusing them of cruelty or incompetence. In that fertile soil of mistrust, a story of a child cut open on a kitchen table needed no evidence to thrive. It gave form to real fear that those meant to heal could betray. Psychologists add another layer. The Pickmans' experiences in the 1990s, scratches on Tony's body, toys rearranged, cold spots in the nursery, fit patterns well known in cases of suggestion and stress. Sleep deprivation, heightened anxiety, and group expectation can create physical symptoms. Scratches can be self-inflicted without awareness, a phenomenon known as dermatographia, where stress causes welts to rise on the skin. Combine this with the family's growing belief in Sallie, and the legend had its perfect stage: a house, a frightened couple, and a cultural appetite for the paranormal. The mirror visions, too, find explanations. Staring into a dim mirror can trigger the Troxler effect, in which features fade and morph until faces distort. Add the power of expectation that visitors are told to look for a little girl, and the mind supplies what it anticipates. The result is not deceit, but the strange capacity of the human brain to project its fears into the world around it. And yet, the absence of Sallie in the archives does not weaken the legend, it strengthens it. In folklore, what cannot be proven becomes more alluring. The silence of the records becomes a kind of proof itself. They covered it up, they forgot her, they erased her name. Each gap in history becomes filled with story, and story is more flexible, more enduring than fact. Thus, the truth is both mundane and haunting. No little girl named Sallie died on that table, but countless children across Kansas did die in surgery, or from infection, or from the crude limitations of medicine at the time. Their voices, their memories, became condensed into one figure, an imagined child whose tragedy could be retold endlessly. Sallie may not exist, but she is built from the grief of hundreds who did. This is the deeper terror, that ghosts need not be real to haunt. The Sallie House is not a monument to one lost girl. It is a monument to fear itself, fear of doctors, fear of disease, fear of betrayal in the moment of greatest vulnerability. When visitors walk its halls and swear they hear a child's giggle or see small eyes in the mirror, they are not encountering Sallie. They are encountering the long echo of human anxiety, dressed in the shape of a girl who never lived. And so the truth of Sallie House is not that it is haunted by a child, but that it is haunted by the power of story. Records may remain blank, cemeteries silent, but the legend thrives. Sallie endures not because she was real, but because belief made her so. And belief, unlike flesh, does not die. Deep in the woods near Kaysville, Utah, a monument once stood that defied simple explanation. A massive stone cross, more than 20 feet tall, rising out of the earth like the remains of some forgotten temple. Locals called it Kay's Cross, and from the beginning, it seemed less like a relic of faith than a scar carved into the land. The cross stood in a clearing surrounded by thickets and shadows. By day, hikers stumbled upon it with surprise, wondering who had built it and why. By night, it became something else entirely, a stage for dread. Teenagers whispered that the air grew colder near its base, that animals refused to approach, that even flashlights flickered when pointed at the stone. They told of figures moving among the trees, pale shapes that vanished when approached. The place was not merely strange, it was wrong. Rumors soon explained the unease. Some said the cross had been built by a secret sect, a religious commune whose rituals mixed Christianity with darker, forbidden rites. Others swore it was the marker of a mass grave, its stone arm stretching over the restless dead. A few even whispered that the monument had been cursed from the moment it was raised, that its builders sealed their own damnation into its mortar, binding the land to their sin. For those who dared to visit, the experience was unforgettable. Young couples driving out on moonless nights told of headlights dimming as they neared the clearing. Friends daring each other to touch the cross reported sudden waves of nausea, dizziness, or panic so intense they fled without looking back. Some claimed to hear whispers rising from the ground itself, words too muffled to understand, but unmistakably human. By the late 20th century, Kay's Cross had become a rite of passage for local youth, as much a dare as Gore Orphanage or the Sallie House. To claim you had stood before the stone was to claim bravery. To admit you had fled was no shame, for the legend insisted that the place itself wanted you gone. Then came the fire. In 1992, the cross burned, not toppled, not shattered, but burned, as if stone could somehow catch flame. Witnesses swore they saw blue light flickering along its surface before it collapsed into rubble. For believers, the destruction confirmed what they had always suspected. Kay's Cross was no ordinary monument. It was cursed, and the fire was the earth's way of rejecting it. Historians tried to trace its origin. Some found records of a polygamous sect in the early 1900s, a breakaway group whose compound stood near the site. Rumors of abuse, strange rituals, and sudden disappearances clung to their name. Yet documentation was scarce and speculation soon overwhelmed fact. The ambiguity only fed the legend. If the cross had been built by a cult, then perhaps their sins explained the unease. If it had not, then its very mystery became evidence of darker powers at work. Today, little remains of Kay's Cross but rubble and memory. Yet in those stones lies the shadow of a towering figure that once dominated the forest clearing. Visitors still walk the trails, still whisper of the curse, still shiver when the wind passes through the trees. The cross may have fallen, but its legend stands unbroken. For some, Kay's Cross is proof that places can be marked, that human actions, whether faith or folly, can stain the earth. For others, it is simply a story, a local myth exaggerated by teenagers and thrill seekers. But for those who stood before it, in the quiet of the Utah woods, the impression remains, a monument not of hope but of dread, a cross that bore not salvation but shadow. No monument attracts silence for long. Where mystery stands, stories rush in to fill the void. Kay's Cross, looming in the woods near Kaysville, Utah, quickly became not only a landmark but a magnet for rumor. And the rumors were never gentle. They spoke of blood, sacrifice, and a hidden cult whose sins lingered long after the stone had cooled. Locals whispered that the cross was built not by pious hands but by a secretive polygamous sect in the early 20th century. According to the tale, the sect's leader commanded absolute obedience. He promised salvation to his followers but demanded offerings in return. Some say he demanded wives, others say he demanded children, and some insist he demanded blood. By the 1950s, teenagers in Davis County repeated stories of midnight rituals held in the clearing. They claimed that robed figures gathered at the base of the cross, chanting verses twisted from scripture. Bonfires blazed, animals were sacrificed, and their cries mingled with the crackle of fire. A few dared to claim that not only animals, but people, had been buried beneath the stone. The cross, they said, was less a monument than a lid, sealing the restless dead beneath. Whether anyone ever witnessed such ceremonies is doubtful, but the rumors spread as if they were fact. Newspapers occasionally mentioned the site, always with a tone of nervous curiosity. Strange goings-on was the phrase that appeared, vague enough to feed imagination, specific enough to lend weight to whispers. And with each retelling, the rituals grew bloodier. What began as hints of chanting became vivid tales of screaming victims, crimson stains on stone, and faces glimpsed in the firelight. Psychologists note how rumors of blood rituals cling to isolated religious groups. Communities already viewed with suspicion, whether for polygamy, secrecy, or simply difference, become easy targets. When tragedy strikes or records run thin, the imagination supplies horrors. Kay's Cross became a screen onto which outsiders projected their fears of the unfamiliar. The less people knew of its origin, the darker their theories became. Yet believers insist the rumors explain too much to dismiss. Visitors reported finding dead animals near the site, bones scattered, feathers singed. To skeptics, these were the remains of predators' meals or the work of pranksters. To those steeped in legend, they were offerings, proof that the rituals had never stopped. Even the fire that consumed the cross in 1992 was reinterpreted through this lens. Perhaps the curse grew too heavy, and the monument ignited from the sins sealed within. For folklorists, Kay's Cross demonstrates how ritual rumors work. They are not simply lies. They are communal expressions of anxiety, dramatized into stories of blood and shadow. The image of cultists in robes, sacrificing by firelight, is a narrative that appears in legends across America. It reflects both fear of the occult and fascination with forbidden power. Kay's Cross provided the perfect stage. A lonely clearing, a towering monument, and no official history to contradict the imagination. By the time ghost hunters arrived in the late 20th century, the rumors had hardened into certainty. Investigators describe hearing chants in the wind or feeling watched by unseen congregations. Some claim to see red stains on the rubble long after the cross had fallen. These details, unverifiable yet persuasive, ensured that Kay's Cross was remembered less as a religious monument than as a site of sacrifice. In truth, no records confirm human sacrifice at the site. The sect once associated with the cross did exist, but evidence of blood rituals is absent from history. Still, absence is fertile ground for folklore. And so, even today, hikers tread carefully through the clearing, glancing at the rubble with unease, as if expecting the ground itself to whisper prayers twisted by blood. The rumors of Kay's Cross endure because they satisfy a need, the need to explain unease with drama, the need to turn mystery into menace. Whether or not any blade ever drew blood there, the imagination has already filled the stones with screams, and once imagination stains a place, no fire, not even the one that destroyed the cross, can burn it clean. They called her the White Lady long before anyone agreed on what she was. Some said a widow from the breakaway sect that raised Kay's Cross, condemned to wander the clearing for sins she never chose. Others claimed she was a victim, buried beneath the stones, her spirit bleaching to a colorless glow. The descriptions vary in the telling, but the image remains. A figure in white, standing where the cross once broke the sky, luminous as frost and still as prayer. The earliest accounts are plain and unnerving. In the 1930s, a boy cutting through the woods at dusk saw a woman in a white dress beside the cross. She didn't move when he called out. She didn't turn when he stumbled and snapped a branch. Only after he ran did he realize the wrongness. There had been no path where she stood, only bramble and stones that would have shredded any hem. Later, a pair of hunters swore a pale shape crossed the clearing between them without a sound. They found no tracks on the hard, sandy soil. Decades later, teenagers brought flashlights and bravado. The bravado rarely lasted. One group from Kaysville High told of a figure coalescing in their beams, white cloth funneling from shoulders to earth, the edges fraying into fog. When they raised the light to a face, there was none, only a blur that suggested eyes. The girl at the front fainted. Two boys carried her back to the road while the others scrambled after, certain they heard something like a dress swishing behind them. They refused to go back for months. The stories multiplied. Couples parking near the trailhead described a white form mirrored in the windshield, standing where no person stood. A jogger, cresting the hill at sunrise, saw a woman in a nightdress motionless amid the brush. When he stepped closer, he found only spider silk banded with dew. A sheriff's deputy on patrol one winter evening radioed a report of a female in possible distress, pale, barefoot, staring. By the time he reached the clearing, there was nothing but brittle weeds and the prints of his own boots. Investigators brought instruments, as if measurement could remake fear into facts. EMF meters climbed inexplicably when pointed toward the center of the ruined base. Thermometers dipped by 6, then 8 degrees in a pocket of air that should not have been colder than the rest. Cameras caught the same fleeting anomalies. A column of paler darkness, a veil-shaped smear, the suggestion of fabric where there was only night. Skeptics called it pareidolia, the eye's old habit of making persons from pattern and light. Believers countered that equipment has no imagination. Folklorists who study the migration of ghosts through culture recognized her at once. The White Lady appears around the world, at bridges, on cliffs, in churchyards and forests, always liminal, always waiting. She is grief made visible, a caution wrapped in silk. In places where records are thin and memory is thick, she arrives as a kind of grammar, the mind's way of writing sorrow into the landscape. Kay's Cross, with its unresolved past and theatrical ruin, gave her a perfect stage. Yet the Utah apparition has a trait that unsettles even the dispassionate. She reacts. Numerous witnesses tell of the figure turning, not walking, not pivoting, but reorienting, as if the air itself carried a hinge, and facing the living. Lights dim. Breath fogs in summer. Once, A man felt a cold pressure on his wrist and looked down to see the print of slender fingers in the dust on his coat. He was not alone. The friend beside him described the same touch in the same moment, as if two small hands had reached from the same nothingness. There are explanations, and they are not foolish. Moonlight on pale grass can rise like smoke. Temperature inversions in the trees can drift as visible columns. The human stress response can sharpen hearing, bow the stomach, summon pins of cold that feel like contact. The whiteness itself may be no more than light pooling on mist or moths, a shimmer amplified by expectation. Still, there remains the problem of agreement. Strangers, years apart, describing the same height, the same downward cast face, the same sense that she wishes to be seen and not approached. One night in the early 2000s, a small group gathered at the ruins for an experiment. No cameras, no EMF meters, only notebooks. They stood in a semicircle and recorded in silence whatever occurred. After 10 minutes, 3 wrote nothing, 1 wrote cold, and 1, without looking up, scribbled a single line. White dress at 11 o'clock, head bowed. When they compared notes, a 6th person, who had kept time, said softly that at exactly that minute the breeze had died and the woods had gone soundless, as if something had stepped into the clearing and the night had held its breath. Perhaps that is all she is, the night remembering to hold its breath. Perhaps the White Lady is the shape fear takes when history refuses to come clean. But stand in that ring of rubble where Kay's cross once shouldered the sky, and the distinction between perhaps and is thins. The clearing hums in a way you feel behind the ribs. The trees seem to bend together, a congregation closing ranks, and at the edge of sight, where moonlight loosens the dark, a brightness gathers as softly as cloth. Whether widow, victim, or mirage, she has become the soul of the legend, the face the town gives its unease. The cross burned and fell, the rumors of blood hardened, the years pressed on. But the White Lady remains, a figure stitched from absence, returning again and again to stand where belief and doubt keep their uneasy truce. If she is only air, she is air arranged with purpose. If she is grief with eyes. And if she is a ghost, then the woods of Kaysville are not merely haunted, they are remembering aloud. Sound is the cruelest accomplice of the dark. It travels farther than light, hides its shape, and enters the body in a way sight never can. Around the ruins of Kay's Cross, night carries a signature. Long vowels of air pulling through trees, sudden yelps that snap the spine straight, and, on certain moonless hours, a rising keen that seems unmistakably human. People call them the screams. They are what bring doubters back to belief and believers to their knees. The stories are consistent. A pair of friends, backpacks heavy with thermoses and cigarettes, hear a thin cry lift from the ravine north of the clearing. It comes again, higher, frayed at the edges, as if a throat were being scraped by ice. A couple parked by the trailhead argue in low voices until a single shriek cuts across the windshield and both go silent, hearts punching at their ribs. Hikers stop mid-step as a pitch climbs out of the tree line and seems to arc overhead, not moving, but expanding until the hair rises along their arms. It lasts 3, maybe 4 seconds, then collapses into a disorganized mumble of leaves. There are explanations, and they are not guesswork. The Wasatch foothills are a cathedral for wind. Cold air at night pours downslope in invisible rivers, katabatic flows, that funnel through coulees and gullies, compressing and accelerating. When wind slashes through a narrow throat between trunks or over the ragged lip of a broken wall, it can produce aeolian tones, whistles, moans, even a quasi-voiced wail, Add the tangle of deadfall and rebar still snagged in the rubble, and you have a forest pipe organ tuned to dread. Wildlife contributes with theater's sense of timing. Red foxes scream in mating season, with a sound so close to a child's cry that first-time listeners reach for their phones. Great horned owls trade calls that, with a bit of echo, flatten into something like a human no. Barn owls hiss long and thin, the way a kettle might if it learned grief. In dry years, when the brush is crisp and the wind carries better, these voices braid with the trees and become a single shiver traveling the understory. Then there is the sound you cannot hear but can feel. Under certain conditions, the clearing loads up with infrasound, frequencies below the threshold of conscious hearing, generated by wind shearing along the slope or by distant trains coupling their freight at night. Infrasound around 18 to 19 hertz can stir the viscera, quicken the pulse, and trigger a cold premonition without a named cause. Some laboratory studies note visual disturbances at similar frequencies. Others report a sense of presence just behind the shoulder. Stand in that clearing when the pressure dips and the air hums and the body supplies the ghost before the mind does. Skeptics call it auditory pareidolia, the brain's gift for finding voices in noise. Believers call it evidence. The experience is the same. For a mind primed by rumor, a fox's bark is a child's last breath. A pressure wave becomes a warning. Folklorists would call what follows ostension, the legend shaping behavior, behavior shaping perception. Teenagers arrive expecting screams, and the landscape obliges, not because it is haunted, but because it is loud with natural griefs that happen to speak our language. And yet the night does not give up its certainty so easily. Too many witnesses years apart describe the same sequence. First the hush, an unnatural stillness, as if the woods are bracing, then a thin cry at a distance, moving closer without moving at all, then the sudden impression, absurd, undeniable, that the sound is looking at you. Instruments can map pressure and frequency. They cannot record the moment a person feels recognized by the dark. A small test group once tried to peel the moment apart. They set 2 recorders at opposite edges of the clearing and a third down in the ravine. The anemometer chattered. The night was steady with a 5-knot drift. At 1:13 a.m., all 3 microphones caught a rising band between 700 and 900 hertz, a clean curve like a violin tuning up, lasting 3.2 seconds. The spectrum showed harmonics typical of air moving over edges, wind signature, not a throat's. The group labeled the file Waileolian01.wave, wrote their notes, and packed equipment with calm hands. Later, in the parking lot, one of them sat down hard on the asphalt and wept, unable to explain why a proven whistle had felt like a plea. Perhaps that is the only honest verdict available in the ruins of Kay's Cross. The wind is busy with old work. It combs the trees, finds the hollow bones of the fallen monument, and plays them until the living assign meaning. The screams in the night wind are not evidence that the dead remain. They are evidence that we do. We bring our nerves, our histories, our private griefs, and the land lends them a voice. But if you stand there when the temperature falls, when the foothills pour cold into the ravine and the air takes on that faint metallic smell, do not be surprised if theory thins. Somewhere beyond the black ribs of the trees, a note will lift, stretch, and split, and you will know, beyond charts, beyond names, that something has found the exact shape of your fear and learned to sing it. On a cold February night in 1992, the legend of Kay's Cross reached its strangest chapter. For decades, the monument had stood in the Utah woods, weathered but immovable, its stone arms heavy with rumor. And then, without warning, it burned. Witnesses described the impossible sight, flames licking upward from solid stone, blue light shimmering along the surface as if the cross itself had been set alight from within. Hours later, the structure collapsed into rubble, leaving only scattered boulders and the ash of its mystery. Local newspapers recorded the event in terse lines. Monument in woods destroyed by fire, cause unknown. But those who had long whispered of the curse heard confirmation. They said the land had finally rejected the sins bound into the monument. Others insisted the fire was a final ritual, that unseen worshippers had returned to finish what their sect had started decades before. Still others believed the cross had been struck by divine justice, a punishment for blasphemy raised in stone. The physical facts complicated the story. Kay's cross was built of concrete and rebar, materials not known to catch fire. Forensic investigators suggested that vandals had poured accelerants, gasoline, kerosene, into cracks and cavities, igniting them in a blaze strong enough to weaken the structure. Others speculated about chemical reactions from the soil itself, rich with minerals and debris from years of weathering. But none of these theories fully explained the reports of blue flames crawling upward, or why some witnesses swore they heard voices in the roar. The absence of a clear cause allowed imagination to do what it always does: fill the gaps with fear. In folklore, destruction often cements belief rather than erases it. When the ruins of Kay's Cross smoldered, teenagers did not stop visiting. They came in greater numbers. Touching the rubble was said to bring bad luck. Taking a stone was said to bring nightmares. One local claimed that after pocketing a fragment, his house caught fire the following week. Another insisted that his car refused to start for days until he returned the rock to the clearing. Whether coincidence or consequence, each story gave weight to the idea that the curse had not died with the cross, but had been released by the fire. Folklorists and historians saw something deeper. The burning of Kay's cross transformed it from monument to relic. When the structure stood tall, it was a target for mockery or disbelief, a giant curiosity in the woods. Once destroyed, it became untouchable. Ruins invite reverence. They suggest that something powerful happened, something beyond easy explanation. The fire made Kay's cross eternal, not in stone, but in story. Scientists, meanwhile, point to natural explanations for the strange details. Blue flames, they note, can arise from the combustion of certain chemicals, copper compounds, alcohol-based fuels, even the residue of industrial waste dumped long ago. The Utah foothills are no stranger to hidden debris, remnants of mining and farming that seep into the soil. In this view, the mysterious fire was no miracle, no curse, but the predictable outcome of vandalism colliding with chemistry. Yet even the most rational voices admit that setting a 20-foot concrete cross ablaze is no ordinary act of destruction. For believers, the analysis misses the point. The fire was never about accelerants or vandalism. It was about spectacle, about the night the impossible became visible. To watch stone glow like timber, to see the clearing lit in eerie blue, was to feel the boundary between natural and supernatural dissolve. In that moment, the curse of Kay's Cross was not an idea. It was a flame, undeniable, searing itself into the memory of all who witnessed it. Today, only rubble remains, scattered rocks overgrown with weeds. But those who walk among them speak with a kind of awe, as if the ground still carries heat. The cross may have fallen, but the fire made it immortal. The legend no longer needed the monument to stand. Its ashes were enough. The story of Kay's Cross has always balanced between stone and smoke. On one side stand the facts. A large concrete cross once hidden in the Utah woods, built by human hands and toppled by fire in 1992. On the other side drifts the legend, a cursed monument raised by a cult, marked with blood, haunted by screams and a ghostly woman in white. To expose the truth of Kay's Cross is not to dismiss the fear it inspired, but to untangle how fear and rumor built something taller than stone. Historical records trace the site to a breakaway sect in the early 1900s. Led by a self-styled prophet, the group lived in isolation near Kaysville, practicing a blend of Christian imagery and unconventional polygamist rituals. The cross was almost certainly their monument, part marker, part symbol of authority. But the rumors of human sacrifice, buried victims, or satanic rites are unsupported by evidence. No police reports, no obituaries, no graves ever tied the sect to crimes of blood. What remains is hearsay, amplified by suspicion of groups already considered outsiders. The sect dissolved quietly, but the cross endured, abandoned, and enigmatic, waiting for imagination to claim it. Folklorists explain how this process unfolds. Monuments without clear meaning become canvases for cultural anxiety. In mid-century Utah, a giant cross hidden in the woods invited contradiction. It looked Christian, but its isolation hinted at secrecy. The community, wary of cults and whispers of polygamy, projected onto it their darkest fears. Thus, the bloody rituals were born not from evidence but from unease, stories told to warn children or thrill teenagers. Once repeated often enough, they hardened into legend. The fire of 1992 added fuel. Investigators suggested vandals poured accelerants into the cracks of the structure, igniting a blaze strong enough to bring it down. Reports of blue flames can be explained by chemical residues, copper, alcohol fuels, even industrial waste left in the soil. Yet these explanations never spread as widely as the myth. For believers, the fire proved the curse. For skeptics, it proved that stories can outlast the objects they cling to. Either way, the event transformed the cross from physical monument into eternal symbol. Ashes are harder to question than stone. Even the White Lady, the specter seen drifting through the clearing, fits a wider pattern. Tales of ghostly women in white appear around the world, at bridges, cliffs, graveyards, and roadside shrines. They embody sorrow, regret, and warning. The figure at Kay's cross is less likely a singular spirit than a universal archetype stitched into local rumor. Psychologists would argue that expectation, darkness, and fear bend perception until the human brain supplies the figure it anticipates. But to those who saw her, the distinction between archetype and apparition makes little difference. What mattered was the chill of being watched. The screams in the night wind also find natural explanation. Foxes, owls, and the acoustics of the canyon produce sounds eerily like human cries. Infrasound from wind or distant trains triggers unease, making the body believe something is near when nothing is visible. Scientific terms like aeolian tones and auditory pareidolia explain the how, but not the why. The why is grief and fear, memory and imagination, colliding in a clearing that once bore an unsettling monument. So, what then is the truth of Kay's cross? It is this: no records of murder, no proven curses, no fire of supernatural origin. What remains is the evidence of human invention, an abandoned sect, a strange monument, vandalism, natural acoustics, and the human mind's endless hunger for meaning. Yet the legend persists because it satisfies something facts cannot. It transforms unease into story, mystery into performance. It offers both thrill and caution, a place where belief and disbelief shake hands in the dark. The rubble of Kay's cross holds no power of its own, but the legend built upon it still commands reverence. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth. The ghosts here are not bound to stone or soil. They are bound to us, to our fears, our suspicions, our imagination. We created them, and in retelling them, we ensure they will never die. Long before Hollywood's cameras arrived, before the house on Ocean Avenue became an icon of American horror, it was the scene of a crime so brutal that the walls themselves seemed to absorb the blood. On the night of November 13th, 1974, in the quiet town of Amityville, New York, 23-year-old Ronald DeFeo Jr. took a rifle and murdered his entire family as they slept. The victims were his parents, Ronald and Louise DeFeo, and his four siblings, Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John. Each was shot in their beds. No signs of struggle were found. Neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual, no screams, no shouts, not even the thunder of the gun firing again and again. 6 lives extinguished in silence. The police who entered the house the next morning described it as a scene of nightmare. Children lying face down in their rooms, the smell of gunpowder and blood heavy in the air, crucifixes hanging above beds that no longer held prayers. The mystery began immediately. How could an entire family be killed without anyone waking to fight or flee? How had no neighbors heard the chaos? Speculation grew. Some believed Ronald had drugged his family before pulling the trigger, though toxicology reports found nothing unusual. Others whispered of possession, of voices driving him to slaughter, of an unseen hand that hushed the house while the murders took place. At trial, Ronald DeFeo gave conflicting accounts. At times he claimed he had acted alone, fueled by rage and resentment. At other moments he insisted he had heard voices, low, commanding, irresistible, ordering him to kill. Psychiatrists diagnosed antisocial personality disorder, substance abuse, and paranoia. The jury convicted him of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms. The law had its answer. But the town of Amityville was left with questions that facts could not quiet. In folklore, atrocity is fertile soil. A crime without clear motive committed in a suburban home invites interpretation beyond the human. Soon whispers spread that the house itself was tainted, that it had swallowed the DeFeos in silence. The murders became the foundation of the legend, a house not merely haunted, but hungry. The architecture helped. The Dutch colonial home at 112 Ocean Avenue, with its steep gables and distinctive quarter-moon windows, looked watchful even in daylight. Photographs of the house appeared in newspapers across the country, its windows glowering like eyes above a mouth-shaped porch. Readers did not see an ordinary home. They saw a face that had consumed a family whole. Journalists and locals alike began to speak of the house in hushed tones. They noted its proximity to Shinnecock burial grounds, its history of ownership disputes, the strange silence reported on the night of the murders. One priest, called to bless the house, claimed to hear a voice command him, "Get out." The seed of horror had been planted, and America's most infamous haunted house was beginning to grow in the national imagination. The DeFeo murders were real, recorded, undeniable. But from their blood flowed something larger than crime, a legend that would stretch across books, films, and decades. The Amityville Horror did not begin with ghosts. It began with 6 bodies in their beds, a family extinguished in a silence so complete that ordinary explanations seemed insufficient. That silence still unsettles. More than the rifle, more than the trial, more than Ronald's shifting stories. It is the silence that lingers, as if the house itself closed its throat around the screams and has never opened it since. When George and Kathy Lutz signed the deed to 112 Ocean Avenue in December of 1975, they believed they were stepping into a dream. The house was spacious, handsome, and shockingly affordable. $80,000 for 3 stories, a boathouse, and a pool. The price was low because everyone in Amityville knew what had happened inside just a year before. But the Lutzes convinced themselves that murder was a tragedy of people, not of places. They moved in with Kathy's 3 children and a black Labrador named Harry. Within 28 days, they would flee in terror, leaving their furniture behind. The strangeness began quietly. Cold spots in rooms with no draft, swarms of flies materializing in the middle of winter. George, once an easygoing stepfather, grew sullen and volatile, waking at 3:15 every morning, the very time the DeFeo murders had taken place. Kathy reported vivid nightmares of the killings, describing details she could not have known. The children complained of an invisible friend named Jody, who sometimes appeared as a pig with glowing red eyes staring from the windows. Then came the escalation. George claimed doors slammed without wind, and strange odors, sweet, putrid, cloying, rose suddenly from nowhere. Kathy described waking to a levitation so violent she thought the bed had been lifted by hands unseen. Crucifixes on the walls turned upside down. The youngest child woke with welts and scratches, though no one had touched him. Even Harry the dog grew frantic, barking at empty corners and refusing to enter the house at night. Friends who visited were shaken. One priest, called to bless the home, reported hearing a guttural voice say, "Get out," a story he later confirmed under oath. A family friend entered the sewing room and fled after feeling a suffocating pressure close around his chest. Each account was passed among neighbors, fueling the sense that 112 Ocean Avenue was no ordinary house. George began to unravel. He chopped wood obsessively, letting his beard grow wild, complaining that he was always cold despite roaring fires. He stopped eating, stopped shaving, stopped smiling. Kathy said she no longer recognized her husband. The transformation fed the idea that the house was not merely haunted, but parasitic, draining the life from those who lived within. The final nights were chaos. Doors slammed through the halls in a deafening chorus. Green slime oozed from the walls. The children screamed of faces peering from their bedroom windows. George swore that when he opened the front door, the lion-headed knocker twisted into a snarl. On the 28th day, in the early hours of morning, the Lutz family gathered what little they could carry and fled into the freezing dark, never to return. Skeptics argue the tale was embellished, even invented. Investigators later pointed out inconsistencies: no records of police calls, no proof of green slime, no photographs of damage. Some suggested the Lutzes, financially strained, had concocted the haunting to sell their story. Others argued that stress, grief, and the grim reputation of the house magnified ordinary creaks and chills into nightmare. But belief is not easily undone. Paranormal investigators swarmed the house. Journalists printed lurid accounts. By 1977, the story had been shaped into The Amityville Horror, a best-selling book that blurred fact and fiction. The Lutz family, whether victims or storytellers, had unleashed a legend that would eclipse even the DeFeo murders in cultural memory. What remains undeniable is this: for 28 nights, a family lived in a house that had already witnessed unthinkable horror. Whether haunted by ghosts, grief, or imagination, they emerged altered, convinced that the home itself had tried to consume them. And in fleeing, they gave the house its lasting name, the house that eats people. Beneath 112 Ocean Avenue, the air thickened. The basement, with its low ceiling and bare concrete walls, was no mere storage space in the Lutz family's account. It was the house's gut, the place where something darker pulsed just beyond human sight. While the upstairs rooms carried the ordinary trappings of family life, beds, curtains, toys, the basement carried whispers, shadows, and the conviction that something lived there that was not them. George Lutz described it first. He would descend the narrow steps, flashlight in hand, and feel the beam falter as if the dark were not emptiness but substance. The corners seemed to resist light, the blackness folding back in after each sweep. More disturbing was the smell, not dust or mildew, but a rancid sweetness, as if meat had spoiled in the walls. At times, George insisted, the odor grew so strong it drove him upstairs gasping. Kathy, too, felt its presence. She spoke of being overcome by dizziness when she stood near the foundation. Once, she claimed, she saw a shimmer in the air at the far wall, a shape tall and indistinct, with shoulders and a head watching her. When she blinked, it was gone. But the children swore they saw the same thing, a shadow in human outline, moving where no one stood. Then there was the red room. Hidden behind a shelving unit, small and windowless, painted in a deep, disturbing crimson, it seemed to serve no purpose. Barely large enough for a child to crouch inside, it became a point of fixation. The dog, Harry, refused to enter, barking furiously whenever George opened its door. Paranormal investigators later measured unusually high electromagnetic readings in the tiny space. For believers, it was the heart of the haunting. For skeptics, it was a storage nook painted a garish color. But to the Lutz family, it was a portal to something malevolent. The children told stories of a dark friend in the basement, a shadow that peeked around corners and vanished when called. At night they refused to sleep alone, convinced that the figure climbed the stairs and lingered at their doors. George reported waking to the sound of footsteps rising from below, heavy, deliberate, stopping outside his bedroom. When he rushed down, he found the basement silent, except for the faint scrape of something dragging along the floor. Visitors corroborated their fear. A family friend exploring the basement felt an unseen force shove him against the wall, leaving bruises across his shoulders. Another swore she saw two glowing eyes peer from the red room, suspended in the dark like embers. Even a priest called to bless the space admitted afterward that he felt something strong, something resistant, pressing against his prayers, as though the very concrete rejected the words. Skeptics offer rational explanations. The basement of any old house carries damp, mold, and poor ventilation. Sweet, cloying odors can come from decaying pests or stagnant water. Shadows seem human-shaped when filtered through stress and suggestion. High electromagnetic fields, common near wiring, are known to induce dizziness, hallucinations, even feelings of dread. The red room, painted by a previous owner, was perhaps no more than a strange decorative choice, and yet, rational or not, the legend thrives because of the detail, the consistency, the sheer conviction of those who claim they saw something there. The basement became the symbolic underbelly of the Amityville story, the place where the house showed its true nature, not as a structure of wood and stone, but as a living presence with secrets it refused to yield. In folklore, basements are always the subconscious of the home, the repository of what a family buries. For the Lutzes, the basement of 112 Ocean Avenue was not simply storage. It was revelation. A space where the mask of normalcy fell away and the house revealed its hunger. Whether ghost, demon, or imagination amplified by fear, the shadow in the basement remains the most chilling resident of Amityville, a figure that stands in the dark and waits, long after the family that fled left the door unlocked. The Lutz family fled 112 Ocean Avenue in January 1976, but the house did not remain silent. Their story, already whispered among neighbors and printed in local papers, caught the attention of writers and filmmakers who recognized its potential. What followed was a transformation more powerful than any haunting, the conversion of a private nightmare into a public myth. The Amityville Horror became not just a case file, but a franchise, a story retold so many times it transcended fact and became folklore. It began with a book. In 1977, journalist Jay Anson published The Amityville Horror, a true story. He drew on hours of taped interviews with the Lutzes, blending their testimony with a dramatized narrative style. Pages dripped with lurid detail, walls bleeding with slime, crucifixes twisting upside down, beds levitating, demonic voices rumbling through the halls. Though marketed as true, the book read like a novel, fast, frightening, and nearly impossible to put down. Readers devoured it. Within a year, it sold millions of copies worldwide. The DeFeo murders were real, but Anson's book ensured that the house became something more, a stage for cosmic evil. Hollywood arrived swiftly. In 1979, the Amityville Horror hit theaters. The film was a box office triumph, terrifying audiences with its image of the Dutch colonial house looming against storm clouds, its quarter-moon windows glowing like eyes. Blood oozed from walls, doors flew open on their own, priests battled invisible forces. By the time the credits rolled, Amityville was no longer a sleepy Long Island town. It was America's most famous haunted address. Sequels followed. So did spin-offs, remakes, documentaries, and endless tabloid coverage. Each retelling magnified the legend, layering new horrors onto the foundation of the Lutz's story. The house became a cultural touchstone, referenced in sitcoms, parodied in cartoons, invoked whenever Americans spoke of haunted homes. Even skeptics contributed to its fame by debunking it. Every article meant to dismantle the myth only confirmed its status as a phenomenon worth arguing about. The irony is sharp. As scholars point out, the more a legend is filmed and franchised, the further it drifts from its origin. By the 1980s, most audiences could not recall the name DeFeo, though his crime birthed the entire saga. Fewer still cared whether the Lutzes exaggerated their ordeal. What mattered was the house as symbol, evil housed in suburbia, proof that horror did not require castles or cemeteries. The terror was domestic, wrapped in wood siding and Dutch colonial charm. Folklorists note how Hollywood's version of Amityville echoed deeper cultural anxieties. The 1970s were a decade of economic decline, collapsing trust in authority, and fractured family life. To see a home, the very core of American stability, turn hostile struck a nerve. The house devoured not only the Lutzes, but the illusion that suburbia was safe. Each scream on screen resonated with a society learning that its own foundations were unstable. Meanwhile, tourism boomed. Visitors flocked to Long Island, snapping photographs outside 112 Ocean Avenue until owners changed the windows to disguise the facade. Booksellers lined shelves with lurid covers. Paranormal investigators used the case as a cornerstone for television specials. The town itself begged the public to stop, weary of being defined by a nightmare. But Hollywood had ensured that Amityville was no longer just geography. It was a brand. By the turn of the millennium, the legend had spiraled far from its roots. The 2005 remake of the Amityville Horror introduced new horrors, ghostly children, distorted visions that had never been part of the Lutz story. Yet audiences embraced it because by then, truth was irrelevant. The myth had outgrown the facts. The flames of Hollywood did more than fan the fear. They fossilized it. Whether one believed the Lutzes or dismissed them as opportunists, the house had become immortal in the collective imagination. And perhaps that is the real horror. Not what happened in Amityville, but how quickly fear can be filmed, packaged, and sold until the legend feels more real than the lives it once consumed. By the late 20th century, Amityville was no longer just a house. It was an idea, a cultural shorthand for haunted suburbia, a name that conjured dread even among those who had never read Jay Anson's book or seen the films. The Dutch colonial at 112 Ocean Avenue had entered the American psyche not as architecture, but as symbol. proof that the most terrifying places are not castles on foreign hills, but the homes that look like ours. Magazine covers in the 1980s featured its glaring quarter-moon windows, framing them as eyes that watched the nation. Halloween costumes mimicked its facade. Rock bands sampled dialogue from the films, and late-night comedians referenced the house as if it were as recognizable as the White House or Graceland. In pop culture, Amityville was less geography than iconography. Folklorists argue that the house's power lies in its ordinariness. The DeFeo murders and the Lutz hauntings occurred not in an ancient ruin, but in a comfortable middle-class home, complete with a boathouse and swimming pool. Its manicured lawn and suburban setting clashed violently with the horrors described inside. This dissonance was the hook. If Amityville could be haunted, then any home could be. Horror was no longer elsewhere. It was next door. As the legend spread, Amityville became a lens for cultural fear. In the Cold War years, Americans worried about unseen forces invading domestic life. The house became a metaphor for infiltration. During economic downturns, its low sale price and cursed reputation embodied anxieties about the collapse of the American dream. For families navigating divorce, drugs, and suburban malaise, the image of a home that devoured its occupants rang uncomfortably true. The Amityville story was elastic enough to carry all of these anxieties, its details shifting as needed, its meaning constantly renewed. Tourism cemented its status, though the homeowners tried to discourage visitors, changing the windows, altering the address. Thrill seekers still came, drawn by a need to stand before America's most infamous haunted house. Paranormal television made Amityville a recurring stage, returning again and again to test the air for evidence, as though one more camera might finally capture what millions already believed. Each new investigation, skeptical or not, reaffirmed its significance. The house did not need to prove its haunting. Its legend was the haunting. Even skeptics contributed to the icon. Debunking books, skeptical documentaries, and critical essays all kept the house alive in discourse. In attempting to kill the myth, they ensured its survival, because nothing fuels folklore more than argument. The question, did it really happen, is itself the heartbeat of legend, and Amityville has thrived on that pulse for nearly 50 years. By the 21st century, the house had transcended its address. Amityville became a brand, stamped onto a sprawling series of sequels, spin-offs, and low-budget films with little connection to the original events. The name alone promised dread, as marketable as Dracula or Frankenstein. Though many of these adaptations were derided, they reinforced the house's status as an inexhaustible reservoir of horror. The irony is stark. The current owners of 112 Ocean Avenue live in peace, reporting nothing unusual beyond gawking tourists. Yet for millions of people, the house remains a place where evil itself resides. Its cultural weight has made it untouchable, too deeply embedded in the imagination to ever fade. In the end, Amityville is not about the DeFeos, nor the Lutzes, nor even the building itself. It is about the way fear inhabits culture, how stories repeat until they become symbols, and how symbols become eternal. The house is not haunted because of what happens inside its walls. It is haunted because we have decided it is, and because in that decision, we keep returning to its quarter-moon windows, waiting for them to blink. The legend of Amityville stands on two pillars: the fact of 6 murders and the tale of 28 haunted nights. The first is undeniable. The second has been questioned since the moment it was told. To expose the truth of Amityville is to sift rumor from record, myth from memory, and to see how a crime scene became a cultural empire. Investigators who examined the Lutz's claims found troubling inconsistencies. George and Kathy described doors torn off hinges, locks broken, and windows shattered. Yet when the next owners moved in, they reported no damage. The green slime that supposedly oozed from the walls left no trace. The famous Red Room in the basement, a supposed portal of evil, was little more than a storage nook painted by a previous tenant. Police confirmed that no emergency calls came from the house during the month the Lutzes lived there, despite the family's claims of nightly terror. Neighbors, too, contradicted the story. None reported strange lights or demonic roars. No one saw the pig-like creature with glowing eyes that the children claimed to meet. Some recalled that George had been fascinated with the occult before buying the house, raising suspicion that his imagination colored their nights. Others noted that the Lutzes fled in January, but soon returned with writers and lawyers, preparing to sell their story. The book that cemented the legend, Jay Anson's The Amityville Horror, took further liberties. Tapes of the Lutzes' interviews reveal anecdotes retold with new detail, embellished for drama. Scenes were condensed, characters added, timelines altered. What was already a frightening account became a marketable narrative, a story designed to terrify readers and sell millions of copies. Skeptics argue that Anson's book was not journalism, but horror fiction wrapped in a claim of truth. Even within the Lutz family, accounts shifted. George and Kathy held to their story until their deaths, but other relatives wavered. Daniel Lutz, one of Kathy's sons, insisted decades later that the haunting was real, though filtered through trauma and fear. Christopher Lutz, his brother, claimed much of it was exaggerated, that George's obsession with the paranormal magnified ordinary events. These contradictions widened the gap between fact and myth, leaving researchers to wonder where memory ended and invention began. Psychologists suggest the Lutzes may have experienced a form of collective delusion, fueled by stress, financial strain, and the oppressive history of the DeFeo murders. Living in a house where 6 people had been killed could easily heighten anxiety, amplify normal creaks into sinister footsteps, and turn shadows into figures. Sleep deprivation, group reinforcement, and suggestibility can explain the more dramatic experiences. The human mind confronted with an unbearable setting can conjure terrors as vivid as any ghost. And yet, the absence of proof never diminished the legend. It strengthened it. The contradictions became fuel for debate, and debate is the oxygen of folklore. Skeptics wrote books dismantling the haunting, while believers countered with new evidence: photos of phantom figures, recordings of voices, maps linking the house to supposed native burial grounds. Every attempt to end the story simply prolonged it. The truth, then, is double-edged. The DeFeo murders were real, tragic, and well documented. The Lutz haunting, by contrast, shows every sign of exaggeration, misinterpretation, or invention. No demonic slime, no levitating beds, no furniture hurled by unseen hands. What remained was a family in crisis and a public ready to believe that evil could live in a house. The most unsettling truth is not whether the Amityville haunting was real. It is how easily America embraced it. A crime scene became a tourist attraction, a family's trauma became box office gold, and a myth grew so large that it no longer required evidence to survive. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue may be just wood, stone, and silence. But in the imagination, it remains the home that eats people, because we wanted it to. Deep in the pine forests of Chatham County, North Carolina, lies a patch of ground that refuses life. Perfectly round, about 40 feet across, it is a circle where grass will not grow, where shrubs wither, where even weeds seem to shrink away from the soil. Locals call it the Devil's Tramping Ground. The place has been known for centuries. Early settlers warned their children to avoid it. Native tribes before them spoke of a cursed clearing where even animals did not linger. To this day, visitors say the earth inside the circle feels different beneath their feet, harder, drier, drained of warmth. By day, it looks like nothing more than a bald patch in the woods. But by night, it becomes something else entirely. A stage for the imagination, a place where silence presses too tightly and the trees seem to lean back, as if keeping their distance. The legend is simple and terrifying. Each night, the devil himself rises from the underworld and paces the circle, plotting new mischief against humankind. His hooves scorch the soil, killing all growth. By morning, he vanishes, leaving only the barren earth as evidence of his midnight vigil. For generations, travelers swore they saw glowing eyes in the dark, heard laughter drifting from the clearing, or felt an oppressive presence pressing against their chests when they stepped inside the ring. Experiments became rites of passage. Teenagers dared one another to spend the night in the circle, only to flee in panic before dawn. Campers reported waking to find their tents dragged a few feet, as if something had nudged them outward. Objects left in the clearing were said to vanish or be violently tossed beyond the perimeter by morning. Skeptics who tried to prove the place harmless admitted to unease. Even those who laughed at the devil's name left quickly once the sun set, as though the circle itself demanded respect. Folklorists note that the devil's tramping ground shares traits with legends across the world. Sacred or cursed spaces where nothing grows, often tied to gods, spirits, or demons. Such sites serve as boundaries between the human world and the unknown, symbols of disorder carved into landscapes of order. In America, with its mixture of Christian fear and frontier imagination, the barren circle naturally became linked to Satan. Science offers its own theories. Soil tests have shown unusually high levels of salt and copper, which can hinder plant growth. Some geologists suggest that the patch lies atop a vein of acidic mineral that sterilizes the earth. Others point to fungal blight, which can spread underground and poison roots. None of these explanations are definitive. Even after decades of study, the circle remains oddly resistant to vegetation. For believers, the ambiguity is proof. If science cannot explain it fully, then something darker must be at work. And so the devil's tramping ground persists, both tourist attraction and forbidden zone. Each year, visitors stand at the edge, debating whether to step inside. Some scoff, insisting it is nothing but bad soil. Others linger at the boundary, staring into the barren patch, feeling the hair rise on their arms. For them, the circle is not just dirt. It is an invitation and a warning. Whether product of geology or legend, the devil's tramping ground holds its power because it offers no certainty. It is a mystery you can walk into, a void you can measure with your own steps. And once you leave, the question follows: was it only earth beneath your feet, or was something pacing there beside you, unseen, keeping the soil forever bare? If the barren circle is unsettling by day, it becomes unbearable by night. Under the weight of the stars, when the forest turns black and the wind dies, the devil's tramping ground earns its reputation. For locals, the emptiness of the circle is not the only warning. It is the sound, or rather, the sound that should not exist, that convinces them of something more. They call it the devil's laughter. Generations of Chatham County residents tell the same story. Stand near the circle after midnight, and you may hear a low chuckle drifting through the trees. Sometimes it rises suddenly, a sharp bark of amusement. Other times it spreads slowly, beginning with a whisper of breath before swelling into full-throated mirth that echoes against the pines. Those who claim to have heard it agree on one detail: it never sounds human. The rhythm is wrong, the tone stretched too far, as though the forest itself had learned to laugh. One farmer in the 1930s described hitching his mule near the circle and pausing to rest when he heard it. "It weren't no owl," he swore. "It was like something enjoying a joke too big for me to understand." His mule bolted, nearly snapping the harness, dragging him half a mile before calming. Others in later decades reported similar experiences: cars stalling near the clearing, radios erupting with static, followed by a faint giggle, hunters hearing bursts of laughter that scattered their dogs. Teenagers on dares often return pale and shaken. They describe setting up camp chairs just outside the circle, waiting in the silence. Then, without warning, the sound comes, sometimes distant, sometimes so close it seems to vibrate in their ribs. One group in the 1970s fled after hearing what they swore were two distinct voices laughing together, circling the barren ground in opposite directions. Folklorists interpret the devil's laughter as an auditory extension of the legend. Laughter is unsettling when stripped of context. It implies knowledge withheld, a joke told at your expense. In folklore, demonic figures often laugh not in joy but in mockery, reminding mortals of their helplessness. The barren circle already represents a place where order breaks. The laughter is the soundtrack of that collapse, a sound that turns emptiness into menace. Science, as ever, offers alternatives. The forests of North Carolina are home to foxes, whose shrill cries in mating season can mimic a scream or hysterical laugh. Barred owls produce a series of hoots that, when echoed through dense woods, resemble drunken chuckling. Coyotes, too, yip and howl in groups that can sound uncannily like a chorus of deranged laughter. Add the acoustics of the clearing, a natural amphitheater where sound bends and magnifies, and the devil's mirth can be explained by biology and echo. Yet the explanation never seems to satisfy those who have heard it. Foxes and owls are expected in the woods, their calls familiar to hunters and farmers alike. The laughter at the devil's tramping ground, witnesses insist, is different. It feels directed, intentional, as if someone or something is aware of the intruder and amused by their fear. It is not simply noise, it is acknowledgement. Psychologists suggest this reaction may stem from auditory pareidolia, the brain's tendency to impose meaning on ambiguous sounds. In a place already saturated with legend, the mind reshapes natural cries into the one thing the story promises: the devil's laugh. But in the stillness of midnight, with the circle looming like a wound in the forest floor, the distinction between perception and reality blurs. And so the laughter endures, both as experience and warning. Locals still tell their children not to wander near the clearing after dark. Campers still whisper of sounds that rise without wind, without origin, curling around their spines like smoke. Whether born of foxes, echoes, or fear, the devil's laughter is real to those who hear it, and in the barren circle, real is more than enough. Legends are rarely as persuasive as loss. It is one thing to whisper about the devil's laughter, another to return home without the dog that followed you into the woods. Around the devil's tramping ground, the most unsettling stories are not of sounds or shadows but of animals, beloved companions who step into the barren circle and are never seen again. For more than a century, locals have told of dogs who darted into the clearing only to vanish without a trace. Hunters say their hounds, trained to follow scent without hesitation, balk at the circle's edge, growling, hackles high, refusing to cross. But when one is coaxed or dragged inside, the reaction is violent. The dog whimpers, thrashes, and bolts away into the forest, sometimes never to return. Farmers recall cats that strayed near the circle at night, only to disappear as if the ground had swallowed them. One of the earliest written accounts dates to the 1920s, when a family picnicked near the site. Their collie trotted into the clearing, chasing nothing in particular. Moments later, they heard a high yelp, followed by silence. They searched the ring, combed the woods, and called for hours. The collie never returned. In the 1950s, a pair of brothers recounted losing their hound in the same way. It was like he ran straight through a door, one told a newspaper decades later. One second he was there, next second he was gone. Even today, visitors share similar tales online. A camper wrote of tying his Labrador near the circle. At midnight, the leash went slack. The dog was gone, the collar still clasped. Another hiker swore she saw a cat walk into the barren earth, vanish in a blur of motion, and never emerge. Such stories multiply because they touch something primal, the terror of losing what is loyal and familiar in a place that already feels wrong. Science again offers possibilities. Coyotes prowl the woods of Chatham County, swift and opportunistic. Bobcats stalk silently in the underbrush. An animal entering the clearing may have bolted at a sudden movement, swallowed by the night before its owner could react. Others argue that the soil within the circle contains toxins, high salt, copper, or fungal spores that disorient pets, causing them to panic and flee. The loss is tragic, but not supernatural. And yet the consistency of the accounts unsettles. Animals are instinctive. They do not read folklore, do not fear names like the devil's tramping ground. Their unease carries a weight that human superstition cannot fabricate. Dogs refusing to enter, cats slinking away with tails puffed, birds veering wide in flight, these behaviors suggest that the barren earth radiates something perceptible, even if science has yet to measure it. Psychologists note that legends amplify memory. A lost pet near the circle becomes a vanished pet because the circle is nearby. Grief bends into narrative, and narrative endures longer than grief. Yet even skeptics admit the detail that returns again and again. The sound of a whimper cut short, the leash gone slack, the clearing suddenly silent. Folklorists frame the vanished animals as sacrifice stories, echoes of older myths where offerings appease spirits or demons. The pets that vanish give the legend teeth. They transform the circle from eerie curiosity into threat, from barren soil into predator. The devil's tramping ground is not only empty, it takes. Today, warnings remain. Locals advise visitors to keep dogs leashed, cats indoors, livestock far from the woods. Whether the danger is coyotes, toxins, or nothing at all, the fear persists. Step into the clearing alone, and you risk only a chill. Let your pet follow, and you risk never seeing it again. Perhaps that is why the stories endure. It is easier to laugh at whispers of the devil than to dismiss the empty bowl of a dog that never returned. In that absence lies the true haunting. Not ghosts, not fire, but the silence left behind when loyalty vanishes into the dark. By the late 20th century, the devil's tramping ground had already earned its place in local folklore. But for a generation raised on science fairs and late-night documentaries, rumor alone was not enough. In the 1970s and 80s, groups of students from nearby universities began to treat the barren circle not just as a haunted clearing, but as a laboratory. They brought cameras, tape recorders, thermometers, and notebooks, determined to test whether the legend could survive the scrutiny of measurement. The first experiments were simple. Students drove stakes into the soil inside and outside the circle, planting seeds of rye and clover. In the outer soil, the seeds sprouted within days. Inside the circle, germination was sparse, growth stunted, the stalks yellowing before reaching a hand's height. Samples taken to labs showed unusually high salt and copper content in the barren patch, enough to inhibit plant growth. To the students, it was chemistry. To locals, it was confirmation. The soil had been poisoned by something unholy. Other groups camped overnight, setting up infrared cameras and cassette recorders. One team in 1981 reported that their batteries drained inexplicably within minutes, though fresh replacements worked normally once carried beyond the ring. Their tapes captured faint anomalies, a low hum like wind funneling through a pipe, and, once, what sounded like a short stuttering laugh. Skeptics called it equipment failure, but the students admitted later that none of them slept that night. Perhaps the most dramatic account came from a group in the 1990s, styling themselves amateur paranormal investigators. They placed a tent squarely in the center of the circle and climbed in with recorders running. At 2:43 a.m., one of them awoke to find the tent's fabric rippling inward as though pressed by invisible hands. A second later, the entire tent shifted 3 feet to the east. They scrambled out, certain they had been dragged. In the morning, they returned with daylight confidence, convinced they would find tracks or drag marks. They found nothing, only the hard, bare soil, undisturbed. Scientists, of course, offer mundane explanations. High salinity and mineral imbalance explain the soil. The battery failures might be due to corroded connections or humidity. The laughter on tape could be foxes, owls, or even the students themselves whispering without remembering. The moving tent, wind, misperception, or the restless shifting of campers half dreaming in a legendary place. But even within skeptical accounts, there are gaps. Soil tests have varied wildly depending on who collected them, sometimes showing no abnormalities at all. Batteries that fail only within a 40-foot circle resist easy dismissal, and the tent, whether dragged by prank or wind, remains the story that resurfaces most often, retold with a shudder by those who weren't there but feel as if they had been. Folklorists see these experiments as part of the legend itself. In modern culture, testing a haunting does not dispel it, it sustains it. Each failed attempt at proof, each blurry photograph or ambiguous sound file becomes another layer of mystery. The Devil's Tramping Ground thrives precisely because it resists resolution. To study it is to feed it. The young scientists came seeking certainty. Instead, they found themselves woven into the story they hoped to unravel. Their notebooks, their cameras, their frightened testimonies joined the chorus of farmers, hunters, and teenagers before them. In the end, their data mattered less than their experience. The conviction that for one night, in one barren circle, the world refused to behave as it should, and so the legend endures, not despite science, but because of it. The experiments proved nothing conclusive, yet every inconclusive result became another invitation to test again. The Devil's Tramping Ground remains both lab and altar, a place where equations falter, where folklore bends instruments, and where even the most rational visitor leaves with a question that weighs heavier than any answer. What, if anything, walks that circle when the night is at its darkest? Legends survive on whispers, but in America, whispers often grow into industries. By the turn of the 21st century, the Devil's Tramping Ground had crossed the line from folklore into commerce. What was once a hidden clearing known only to locals became a stop on ghost tours, a feature in guidebooks, and eventually a pilgrimage site for thrill seekers. The barren circle, once feared as Satan's footprint, was now marketed as entertainment. It began with the curious. Teenagers had always driven out from nearby towns, headlights sweeping the dirt road until the trees opened into the uncanny patch of earth. Word spread, and by the 1990s, visitors arrived from farther afield. College students from Raleigh, campers from across the Carolinas, each hoping to test their courage. Some stayed just long enough to take photographs. Others lingered through the night, clutching flashlights, daring one another to sleep inside the circle. The more stories circulated online, the more traffic the site received. Local businesses took notice. By Halloween season, regional ghost tours added the tramping ground to their itineraries. Brochures promised a first-hand encounter with the Devil's Path, complete with chilling anecdotes of laughter in the wind and pets that never returned. Convenience stores sold souvenirs, Devil's Circle t-shirts, mugs stamped with fiery hoofprints. Tourists left with keepsakes, and the legend grew richer with every retelling. The transformation was not without tension. Longtime residents grumbled about cars clogging rural roads, beer bottles littering the forest, and strangers trespassing at all hours. For them, the circle was not a sideshow but a scar, a place whose unease deserved reverence rather than spectacle. Some attempted to block access, but curiosity proved unstoppable. The barren soil itself was the advertisement, a 40-foot promise that something, natural or not, had set this patch of land apart. Paranormal television accelerated the shift. Crews arrived with night vision cameras, narrating hushed investigations as if the circle were an outdoor stage. When recordings captured sudden cold spikes, shadows flitting across the perimeter, or muffled giggles in the static, ratings soared. The Devil's Tramping Ground became a national curiosity, no longer just a Southern legend, but an American one. Folklorists observed the irony. A site once feared as too dangerous to enter was now trampled by thousands each year, its barrenness preserved not only by soil conditions, but by constant footsteps. The circle became a paradox, sacred in its mystery, profane in its commercialization. Believers argued that the crowds angered the devil, making the site more dangerous. Skeptics countered that tourists proved the opposite, that nothing supernatural waited in the clearing, only stories and shadows. And yet, the power of the place persisted. Even among the most jaded visitors, a strange hush fell when they stepped to the edge of the circle at night. Laughter gave way to nervous silence. Phones shook in trembling hands. Some insisted they felt watched. Others left quickly, unwilling to stay long enough to test their disbelief. Commerce could not strip away the primal unease of barren soil and midnight woods. Today, the Devil's Tramping Ground is both legend and destination. It draws ghost hunters, thrill seekers, folklorists, and casual tourists who want a story to tell. For some, it is proof of the supernatural. For others, it is simply an odd patch of land with a brilliant marketing aura. But for all, it is a reminder that America's haunted places live not only in forests and ruins, but in the imagination. And that imagination, when paired with tourism, can turn a bare patch of dirt into one of the nation's most famous circles of fear. For centuries, the Devil's Tramping Ground has thrived on silence and mystery. The barren circle in the forests of Chatham County, North Carolina, seemed to offer proof that something dark walked the earth each night. But when folklore is measured against fact, the picture that emerges is less about demons and more about the intersection of soil, psychology, and the human need to explain fear. Scientists who studied the clearing found natural causes that weakened the myth's supernatural foundation. Soil samples revealed unusually high levels of salt and copper, both hostile to plant life. Some areas showed fungal blight, which can spread underground, poisoning roots before they sprout. Geologists noted that the circle lies on a patch of sandy soil prone to leaching, meaning rain washes away nutrients faster than vegetation can take hold. In short, the ground is barren not because of hoofprints, but because of chemistry. Even the tales of animals vanishing can be explained by biology. Coyotes, bobcats, and birds of prey patrol the Carolina woods, seizing small pets in moments. Dogs panicking inside the circle may be reacting to the sharp mineral odor of the soil or to subtle vibrations in the earth that humans cannot sense. Ethologists note that animals avoid areas with poor vegetation because such sites offer less cover and fewer food sources. To frightened owners, The refusal of a dog to enter the circle feels supernatural, but to science, it is instinct. The devil's laughter, too, finds answers in the forest itself. Red foxes scream in mating season with a sound that mimics human shrieks. Barred owls hoot in patterns that, when echoed, resemble drunken chuckling. Coyotes howl in packs, their yips merging into the unsettling sound of laughter. Acoustics in the clearing, its circular shape, tree walls, and open sky, amplify and distort these natural calls, transforming wildlife into voices of the damned. As for the experiments of the young scientists, skeptics remind us that legend shapes expectation. Batteries that drain may have corroded contacts. Tents that shift may be nudged by wind. High electromagnetic fields, often caused by underground wiring or mineral deposits, are known to cause dizziness, nausea, and the sense of a presence. Paranormal investigators looking for ghosts in the clearing are as likely to record their own anticipation as any genuine anomaly. Yet debunking does not erase the power of the place. Folklorists argue that the devil's tramping ground endures precisely because it resists definitive answers. The science is solid, but not sensational, leaving space for imagination to creep back in. The circle remains barren enough to unsettle, strange enough to resist casual dismissal. And in that gap, between what we know and what we feel, legends thrive. The truth, then, is not that Satan himself wears a nightly path in the North Carolina woods. It is that the barren circle reveals how humans make meaning from mystery. An unusual patch of soil became a symbol of fear, a test of courage, and eventually a tourist attraction. Stories of laughter, vanishing pets, and restless nights stitched themselves to the clearing until it was no longer just dirt, but a stage where generations confronted the dark. The Devil's Tramping Ground is not haunted by hoofprints. It is haunted by memory of every child warned away, every teenager who swore they heard a laugh, every visitor who felt their pulse quicken at the edge. It is a reminder that the human mind abhors emptiness, filling silence with voices and barren soil with demons. The truth is scientific, the experience is cultural, and the legend, like the circle itself, endures because it refuses to grow old. Across America, from the burning ruin of Gore Orphanage to the silent halls of the Sallie House, from the rubble of Kay's Cross to the infamous facade of Amityville, and finally to the barren soil of the Devil's Tramping Ground, the map of haunted places stretches like a web. Each point on that web marks not just a site of legend, but a wound in memory, where grief, crime, misunderstanding, or simple strangeness left a scar that people could not stop touching. The stories differ in detail: children crying in the night, a ghost with eyes too bright, laughter carried by the wind, a cross that burned though made of stone. Yet beneath the differences lies a shared rhythm, a hook of terror, a crescendo of fear, a twist of revelation, and a conclusion that lingers long after the telling. They are not simply ghost stories, they are case studies in how human beings make sense of the unbearable. Science has pulled back the curtain in each case. Diphtheria explains the phantom cries at Gore Orphanage. Stress and suggestion illuminate the shadows of Sallie House. Kay's Cross was toppled not by curses, but by accelerants and geology. Amityville was shaped by contradictions, a crime scene magnified by media into myth. The Devil's Tramping Ground is barren because of minerals, fungi, and erosion, not because Satan paces its soil. The facts are sturdy, measurable, ordinary.